next up, when to do a remake or to do a reboot. This is interesting. I've never, there are a ton of classic movies that I go, these are timeless. These shouldn't be remade. However, it's really a generational thing. I think it really depends upon when we get to a point that a younger generation would be unwilling to do it. I was recently talking to Matthew Kadish, and he said, he doesn't do any movies. He doesn't like any movies made before 1960. That's just his thing. And I'm like, there's a ton of classic movies that I love from that period, but like the style, he just doesn't work for him. I look at like even, no, I won't say that because that's sacrilegious, but there's even some of our amazing sci-fi movies that we love from the 70s and 80s that I say are untouchable, they're timeless. You stick a kid down today, and pacing is completely different in movies today. And there are just some movies that, although perfect, you cannot get kids today to watch it. I always find that amazing. Like, there are certain cartoons from like the 40s that my daughter will fall in love with. And some of the cartoons that I want to show her that are from like the 90s, some of them she likes, but there's some of them like she just cannot do. She just cannot get into that style or format. But if it has kind of what the current animation style is, if it looks anything like what Paw Patrol and Blaze and all those shows look like, it draws her right in. And I've noticed like it's a trend. So like a lot of people from this age, will knock on like Cal Arts or something, but people are into it. So I look back at some of the movies that I really love that I think are classics, only to find out that movies that I love from like the 60s and stuff, and some from the 50s that I consider Disney classics, are remakes of live-action Disney films from just 20 to 30 years before that. So stuff like Swiss Family Robinson. I really love that. Robinson Crusoe. Like, there are some movies that Disney already remade that I consider like, oh, that's the classic, the new version, that's such a bad reboot. And you look back and you do some research on what the reception is when, like, there were people deriding them then as being, an unnecessary reboot, a worse version. Sometimes they were looked at, wow, what a better version. But to me, like, they're the classics. They're back when it was good, and some of the stuff that have come out recently are like, man, why are they rehashing it? And there's some that I've already experienced them rehashing it in the 90s, and they're rehashing it again. It's being announced as coming out again. I like the 60s version, but there's a 40s version that is truly the original that I've never even seen. So I do think that there is some merit to bringing some of this stuff back. But it's not for the generation that grew up. And so we're always at this odd period where we look at it, when something comes out 40 years later and they reboot it, it's not for you. However, they need to make sure they do it well. They need to make sure, because sometimes they reboot these things and it doesn't have enough to make the next generation actually remember that movie, so that they can complain in 40 years when it's rebooted again. But there definitely are certain movies that I feel like are timeless. But I do think that at a certain point, they'll get remade. And to some point, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I typically don't like remakes of stuff that are classic movies that I like, but at the same time, it keeps those properties in the greater pop culture vocabulary. Okay, and then you did your one on Western. So I thought, I love Western, so I thought I'd figure out and drop in my top 5 Westerns. So my number 1 Western is TOS, Star Trek, the original show. That is such an amazing Western. Love it. Number 2, this is a more recent one. Totally digging The Mandalorian. Total gunslinger, just the music. Beautiful Western. I am a big fan of Firefly, and this is very much the bank heist type Western. They're going from town to town, trying to make it big, riding away from the law. Great Western. I, of course, love Back to the Future 3. That, who does not love hoverboards in their Westerns? It's just an amazing movie. And then my other one that I love Lost in Space. I think Lost in Space is a wonderful Western family frontier story. So those are my top 5 Westerns. Of course, all joking aside, Westerns is something that as a kid, I thought I didn't like. I avoided them. I didn't, Westerns. Which is funny, because there's certain periods of time that I was never really into. And I was never really into the Old West. Just like I was never really into, I don't care for like Civil War, Revolutionary War era. That has never been, but give me more medieval times, whether it be Renaissance or even through the Dark Age. That period fascinates me over in Europe. But the moment we started getting into muskets and all that kind of stuff, all of a sudden I lose interest in that time period. But I'm coming around to a lot of that stuff, and I have recently caught myself, I don't know, this is a good Western, that's a good Western, but if there's a Western on TV, and maybe somebody else is watching, if I end up sitting there for 10 minutes, I'm then engaged, I'm then that, so it's only a matter of time before I go into my Western nerdy deep dive, because I know there's a lot of great content there to tap. It's just when I have the time, because it's definitely something that's appealing to me much more. But you see a lot of parallels in sci-fi, as I just brought out with my little joke.